In a quiet hospital room on Manhattan's East Side, under the hum of fluorescent lights, a nameplate read, Huguette P. Clark, Private. Outside, nurses passed, without glancing twice. Inside, behind drawn curtains, an elderly woman lay surrounded not by family or friends, but by dolls. Hundreds of porcelain faces, perfectly still, staring into the pale light. Few knew that this fragile, reclusive figure was the last heiress of a forgotten empire, the Copper Kings, men who had once ruled the American West with mines, money, and power vast enough to shape the United States Senate itself. Her father, William Andrews Clark, had been one of the richest men of the Gilded Age, a titan whose name stood beside Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt. He had built railroads through the desert, carved towns out of the dust of Montana, and stacked his wealth until it rivaled the Treasury's own gold reserves. And yet, a century later, his daughter, born into that vast fortune, chose to vanish. When Huguette Clark died in the year 2011, the world discovered that she had not been seen in public for more than 7 decades. She owned grand estates worth hundreds of millions, the Clark Mansion on Fifth Avenue, once called New York's Private Palace, and Bello Sguardo, her oceanfront villa in Santa Barbara, where sunlight spilled across empty salons. Both had been left untouched for decades, frozen in time like their absent mistress. She could have ruled the salons of Paris, the art houses of New York, or the gala nights of high society. Instead, she withdrew into a shell of silence, her only contact with the outside world through the voices of caretakers and lawyers. To some, she was a woman haunted by family tragedy. To others, she was a mystery, an heiress protecting her innocence in a world too cruel for wealth. But to those who had once known her, Huguette was the last echo of an age when money built kingdoms, and solitude became their curse. Her story begins not in that sterile hospital room, but in an age when copper gleamed like gold when men crossed mountains to dig out fortunes from the heart of the earth. It was an era of greed and grandeur, where the measure of success was not virtue but victory. And at the center of it all stood her father, a man so powerful he could buy senatorships, shape cities, and yet still hunger for legitimacy in a society that refused to forget his humble beginnings. The irony of their dynasty is almost cruel. William Clark fought his entire life to be accepted by the old money of New York, to see his family rise among America's aristocracy. But the higher he built his palaces, the lonelier his daughter's life became. In the marble halls of Fifth Avenue, where servants moved like ghosts beneath chandeliers, Huguette learned early that wealth could silence a house faster than poverty ever could. Years later, when she finally locked herself away from the world, she wasn't escaping danger, she was escaping expectation. The weight of her family name, the shadow of a father who had turned copper into power, had become a burden too heavy to carry into the modern age. Outside her hospital window, New York pulsed the city her father once helped to electrify with the very copper he mined. Inside, time seemed to dissolve. Her only companions were paintings by Degas, delicate Japanese dolls, and memories that refused to fade. Reporters called her the woman who vanished, but perhaps it was the world that had vanished first, a world of etiquette, formality, and inherited grace, swallowed by a century that worshipped noise and exposure. In the end, her disappearance was not an act of madness, but of mourning a quiet rebellion against the vulgarity of wealth without warmth. She had inherited fortune beyond imagination, but she could never inherit belonging. And so, behind the locked doors of hospitals and the veiled windows of mansions, she lived her final decades in deliberate obscurity, guarding her privacy as her father once guarded his gold. What remained after her death was not merely a fortune, but a question that echoes through the corridors of American history. What does it mean to be the child of a man who built an empire, when that empire leaves you with nothing but silence? As we trace her lineage back to the mines of Montana, to the corridors of Congress and the marble palaces of New York, we uncover the paradox that defined the Clarks, how ambition forged one of America's greatest fortunes, and solitude claimed its last heir. It is a story of copper and ghosts, of power and retreat, and of a woman who chose invisibility over inheritance. The story of Huguette Clark begins here, in the echo of wealth that outlived its purpose, and in the haunting quiet of a dynasty that lost itself to its own success. The story of Huguette Clark begins long before her birth, in the roar of the Montana mines. where copper veins glimmered beneath the earth like molten rivers of fortune. At the heart of that raw frontier stood a man whose ambition was as boundless as the land itself. William Andrews Clark. He was not born into privilege. He was born in the year 1839 in a log cabin in Pennsylvania, to a modest farming family of Scotch-Irish descent. His youth coincided with a restless age, a country surging westward, where opportunity waited for those willing to risk everything. In his 20s, Clark joined the gold rush to Montana, driving an ox cart across plains and rivers until he reached the dusty mining camps of Bannock and Helena. What he found there was chaos, men digging for survival, whiskey-fueled saloons, and law enforced by the fastest gun. But William Clark saw something others missed. Beneath the frenzy, he saw the veins of copper, a metal that would soon power the new century, the telegraphs, the railways, the lighting of cities. Where others sought gold to spend, Clark sought copper to build. He began modestly, buying claims from desperate miners, lending money, and foreclosing on debts. Within a few years, he owned the richest lodes in Butte, the richest hill on earth. His rise was meteoric. He built smelters, railroads, and banks, becoming one of the three copper kings, alongside Marcus Daly and F. Augustus Heinze, whose rivalry carved the economic destiny of the American West. By the 1880s, Clark was a millionaire many times over. He financed opera houses and universities, and in Helena, his mansion of red granite towered like a castle above the prairie. But money alone could not satisfy him. He wanted power, prestige, and above all, legitimacy. The Gilded Age was cruel to the self-made rich. In the drawing rooms of New York and Boston, old money families whispered that the Clarks and their kind were vulgar men who had bought their fortunes in sweat and scandal, not inherited them through bloodlines. And yet William Clark was determined to breach those walls. In 1899, he purchased influence in Washington so openly that his name became synonymous with corruption. The U.S. Senate itself refused to seat him after reports proved he had bribed legislators in Montana to secure his appointment. The scandal was devastating, but not fatal. With stubborn arrogance, Clark turned public disgrace into private resolve. He simply waited, rebuilt his alliances, and 3 years later returned triumphantly to the Senate, elected without a bribe. For Clark, reputation was a commodity like copper, something that could be mined, refined, and reforged. But beneath the armor of success lay a loneliness that mirrored his daughters yet to come. His first wife, Catherine Stauffer, had died young, leaving him with 5 grown children. It was in his later years, already past 60, that he met Anna LaChapelle, a young woman 3 decades his junior, graceful and ambitious, of French descent. She was his secretary, intelligent, attentive, and far from the rigid social circles that had scorned him. Their marriage, quiet yet sincere, scandalized New York's high society. But William did not care. In her, he found what he had never purchased: affection without calculation. In 1906, when Clark was 67 years old, Anna gave birth to their second daughter, Huguette Marcel Clark, in Paris. It was a strange childhood from the very beginning, marked by contrast. A father nearing 70, who had conquered the West with iron and gold, and a mother young enough to be his daughter, who adored art, music, and French refinement. By the time Huguette could walk, she was already surrounded by elegance that bordered on fantasy. The Clarks' Fifth Avenue mansion in New York, completed in 1908, was the largest private residence in the city, with 121 rooms, 31 bathrooms, and its own art gallery and ballroom. Built of limestone and marble, it resembled a Beaux Arts palace transplanted from Europe, a monument to her father's hunger for permanence. Within those halls, Huguette was taught painting, the piano, and perfect diction in both English and French. Servants whispered in corridors. Visitors were received like royalty. Her father's guests included senators, bankers, and opera singers. But for all its grandeur, the house was a museum of isolation. William Clark's older children rarely visited. The gap between the first and second family was unbridgeable resentment, fermented quietly, and gossip followed the Clarks wherever they went. When William moved his family to Washington, D.C. during his Senate term, he purchased a mansion on Massachusetts Avenue so vast it was said to require 50 servants to keep the chandeliers lit. For the young Huguette, these palaces became interchangeable, enormous, immaculate, but strangely airless. Even then, she showed signs of retreat, shy, gentle, and happiest in her nursery painting watercolors rather than mingling with guests. By the time her father retired from public life, he had achieved everything a man of his age could dream: wealth beyond calculation, political power, and the grudging respect of the elite who once mocked him. Yet the cost of that triumph was solitude. He died in 1925 at the age of 86, leaving behind an estate valued at more than $300 million in today's terms and a daughter barely entering her 20s. For Huguette, his death marked the end of certainty. Her mother, Anna, withdrew from public view, dividing her time between New York and Santa Barbara. The grand Fifth Avenue mansion, too large for two women, began to feel like a mausoleum. In the Roaring '20s, America celebrated youth, jazz, and motion, but the Clarks remained frozen in another century, clinging to manners that had long gone out of style. Huguette inherited not only fortune, but fragility, a sensitivity to exposure that would define her life. In photographs from the late 1920s, she appears radiant, petite, delicate, with an almost doll-like beauty, her dark eyes steady yet distant. She loved painting and the opera, studied briefly at the Art Students League, and collected miniatures with a child's fascination. But beneath the poise, there lingered a melancholy, a sense that she belonged to a vanished world. It was during this period that she experienced her first and only marriage, a brief union that ended within a year, leaving her even more withdrawn. Society pages stopped printing her name. Invitations ceased. By the early 1930s, she had vanished from public life altogether. Her lineage was extraordinary. A father who embodied the American myth of self-made success, and a daughter who would become a legend of chosen seclusion. One built an empire of copper and marble. The other inherited its silence. As the Gilded Age faded into memory, the Clark story became an echo of the nation itself, from frontier conquest to urban splendor, from expansion to retreat. The same ambition that had driven William through the mines of Montana would, generations later, imprison his daughter in her own fear of the world. From the roar of smelters to the hush of hospital corridors, their legacy is a study in extremes: creation and decay, visibility and disappearance. And as we leave the mines of Butte behind and return to the marble palaces of Manhattan, one question emerges, shimmering like ore beneath the surface. Can a dynasty built on conquest ever teach its heirs how to live in peace? The Gilded Age, that feverish dawn of electric light and unrestrained ambition, was William Andrews Clark's natural kingdom. By the turn of the 20th century, the man who had once panned streams for gold had become one of the richest Americans alive. His empire, stretching from the copper veins of Montana to the marble boulevards of Manhattan. And yet the more power he gathered, the more he sought to immortalize himself in architecture, art, and legacy, to leave behind not just wealth, but an empire that could never be forgotten. In the industrial boom that followed the Civil War, copper was destiny. Electricity was transforming the world, and copper was its bloodstream. Every telegraph wire, every electric motor, every illuminated street demanded more of it. Clark's mines in Butte produced tons of raw ore daily, smelted in massive furnaces that burned through the night like artificial suns. He had learned to see what others overlooked: the invisible wealth running through wires and engines, powering progress itself. He built not merely a fortune, but a network railroads to move his copper, banks to finance it, and political ties to protect it. The Clark name became inseparable from the city of Butte, where his company, the United Verde Copper Mine, dominated production. But his ambition, restless and relentless, refused to stay confined to the mountains. He wanted the East, the cultural heart of America, to recognize him as one of its own. Thus began his second empire, one of marble, oil paintings, and chandeliers. In New York, construction began on a mansion that would astonish even the Carnegies and Astors. The Clark Mansion at 962 Fifth Avenue, completed in 1908, was described by the New York Times as the most elaborate private residence ever built in the city. It had 121 rooms, its own art gallery, Turkish baths, a music salon, and an underground carriageway. The interiors glittered with gilded plaster, stained glass, and marble from Italy and France. Its grand staircase rose beneath a dome that mimicked the light of a cathedral. William Clark filled it with treasures from Europe, tapestries from the Loire, Venetian mirrors, Flemish paintings, and bronzes looted from forgotten palaces. The ballroom, illuminated by 10,000 candles, was a theater of self-redemption, a place where the once-mocked copper baron could now host senators, industrialists, and even royalty. But for all its brilliance, the mansion carried a subtle sadness. Visitors often noted the silence between rooms, the echo of footsteps that reminded one more of a museum than a home. Anna LaChapelle, elegant and graceful, preferred the quiet salons and the library where she painted and played piano. Their daughter, Huguette, toddled through endless corridors beneath the watchful gaze of French nannies. Her earliest memories would not be of laughter, but of marble, oil, and gold. While William Clark built his legacy in stone, the world around him began to shift. The Gilded Age was giving way to the Progressive Era, a time that questioned the very excess he embodied. Newspapers called men like him robber barons, and the public grew weary of fortunes won in smoke and soot. Yet Clark refused to retreat. He believed his money was proof of destiny, his success a moral victory for the self-made man. To secure his dynasty's cultural legitimacy, he became a patron of the arts. He funded libraries in Montana, supported the Nevada State Historical Society, and commissioned monumental portraits of his family by leading European painters. He sent his older children to Paris, collected rare manuscripts, and donated to universities that once dismissed him. Through philanthropy, he sought to purify the copper that had stained his reputation. But wealth cannot rewrite memory, it only decorates it. Behind closed doors, the tensions of two worlds collided. His older children from his first marriage viewed Anna and her daughter as intruders. Anna, in turn, saw them as relics of a past she wished to forget. The split within the Clark family deepened after William's death, when the fortune fractured into trusts and estates that would feed generations of resentment. For young Huguette, these divisions were invisible but omnipresent. Her childhood was one of discipline and decorum, shaped by European tutors and suffocating expectations. She studied painting and violin, attended private schools in New York, and spent summers by the sea in Bellasguardo, the family's Santa Barbara estate, a sprawling, Mediterranean-style mansion perched above the Pacific. Bellasguardo, beautiful lookout in Italian, was her father's gift to her mother, a sanctuary far from the noise of Manhattan. Its terraced gardens, long colonnades, and sunlit rooms became a dreamscape of another world. From its balconies, one could see the ocean shimmer like molten copper, a quiet tribute to the empire that built it. In those years, Huguette absorbed her mother's refined tastes. Anna adored art, music, and the culture of Paris. She dressed her daughter in lace gowns, hired piano teachers from Europe, and filled their homes with paintings by Corot, Renoir, and Degas. Huguette, graceful and reserved, proved to have a painter's hand and an eye for delicate detail. Her work's soft watercolors of landscapes and portraits revealed a gentleness absent from the world her father had built. As the Roaring Twenties began, America entered its age of noise, jazz, flappers, automobiles, skyscrapers. Yet the Clarks remained frozen in their own time capsule. The mansion on Fifth Avenue, though immaculate, began to feel like an artifact of an empire out of step with the modern world. Society was changing. Money no longer carried the same mystique. The new elite were not copper barons, but movie stars, stockbrokers, and industrial innovators. Still, for a brief moment, the Clark name retained its aura of impossible luxury. Their properties were featured in society pages. Huguette's debut in the late 1920s was modest but noted. Photographers captured her as the image of poise, slender, with dark hair swept back, and eyes that seemed to belong to another century. To those who saw her, she was beauty incarnate, the living ghost of Gilded Age elegance. Yet behind the image, the emotional foundations of her life were already fragile. Her mother, ever protective, feared the greed and scrutiny of outsiders. Public appearances were rare, and friendships discouraged. The older Clark relatives, still bitter over inheritance divisions, kept their distance. Huguette's world was limited to the polished interiors of her homes, her easel, and the company of her mother's few trusted servants. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, it destroyed many fortunes, but not the Clarks. Their wealth, preserved in real estate and trusts, survived untouched. Yet the crash marked a psychological turning point. The age of opulence was over. Extravagance had become obscene. To flaunt wealth was to invite condemnation. For Huguette, who had never been comfortable with display, this was almost a relief. She retreated further into her art and correspondence, preferring privacy to publicity. The golden age of the Clark dynasty ended not with scandal or bankruptcy, but with silence. Their Fifth Avenue mansion, once the crown jewel of New York society, stood eerily empty after Anna and Huguette moved permanently to smaller apartments nearby. In 1937, the mansion was demolished, its marble and ironwork sold for scrap. The palace that had symbolized triumph was reduced to rubble, as if the city itself had erased a memory it no longer wished to bear. What remained was Bellasguardo, that sunlit fortress by the sea, and the vast fortune quietly multiplying in banks and trusts. But to Huguette, inheritance was not a blessing. It was a burden wrapped in expectation, guilt, and the ghosts of a century obsessed with grandeur. As the last chandeliers dimmed in the age of copper, she found herself heir to a world already extinct, one where beauty, wealth, and solitude intertwined until they became indistinguishable. Her father's empire had lit cities, but his daughter preferred darkness. He had built palaces to be admired. She would spend her life behind closed doors. And so, as the golden light of her youth faded into the uncertainty of the modern world, a subtle transformation began. The heiress of copper was becoming the phantom of her own inheritance. Her withdrawal was not yet complete, but the path had already been drawn from the glitter of the Gilded Age to the quiet corridors of self-imposed exile. The next chapter of her life would not be written in marble or gold, but in silence. The silence of a woman who turned away from the empire that built her name, and from the world that could never understand her refusal to live in it. As the glitter of the Gilded Age faded into the gray light of modernity, the Clark fortune survived, but its spirit began to erode. The world that had celebrated opulence now mocked it, and the name Clark, once synonymous with progress, became an echo from another era. For Huguette, who had never sought the stage, this shift was almost a relief and a sentence. After the death of her father in 1925, she lived under the protective shadow of her mother, Anna LaChapelle Clark, who retreated completely from society. The two women moved into a grand apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue, overlooking Central Park, a building so discreet that even the neighbors rarely glimpsed them. The apartment, vast and silent, was filled with art, Persian rugs and furniture from their demolished mansion. Anna surrounded herself with French maids and music teachers. Huguette continued her painting and correspondence. Their lives became a ritual of privacy, refined, precise, and increasingly withdrawn. When the Great Depression swept through America, it barely touched them. Their wealth, preserved in trusts and real estate, insulated them from ruin. Yet isolation has a way of deepening when the world outside crumbles. Invitations stopped arriving. The society pages, once chronicling the Clarks' grandeur, moved on to new names, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and soon, the movie stars. In 1940, Anna Clark died, leaving her daughter completely alone. Huguette was 34 years old, still young, wealthy beyond imagination, but emotionally orphaned. For a brief moment, she tried to reach outward. She rekindled contact with relatives, attended small gatherings, even married a Princeton graduate named William McDonald Gower, the son of a business associate. The marriage lasted less than a year. She filed for divorce quietly, without scandal or bitterness. Friends later recalled her words, "He married the Clark name, not me." After that, she vanished from public view. By the 1950s, the heiress, who had once been photographed in pearls and lace, had become a rumor. Her phone number was unlisted. Visitors were turned away. Yet inside her Fifth Avenue apartment, life continued ordered, meticulous, frozen. She rose late, painted in watercolors, collected dolls, and wrote letters to artists and dealers. She never used a computer, never watched television. Her view of the world came through newspapers and the whispers of her staff. The walls around her were not only physical but emotional. Her father's fortune had built palaces, but it had also built expectations to preserve, to protect, to endure. And Huguette, sensitive and distrustful, took that duty literally. She saw the outside world as predatory, full of those who would exploit her wealth or twist her kindness. Her generosity, paradoxically, became the very thing that chained her to solitude. In 1991, a small incident changed everything. After a minor health concern, Huguette checked into Beth Israel Medical Center in Manhattan. Doctors treated her briefly and advised she could return home. But she refused to leave. Instead, she requested to remain in a private room, under her own expense. She would stay there not for weeks or months, but for nearly 20 years. The hospital staff, at first bemused, grew accustomed to her presence. She was quiet, polite, always writing or painting, surrounded by expensive dolls and books. Her room became an extension of her apartment, immaculate, filled with the scent of lavender and paper. Nurses recalled that she insisted on paying for everything, from meals to medical equipment, even sending extravagant gifts to those who showed her kindness. Her fortune, still immense, continued to grow in value. She owned Bellasguardo, her Santa Barbara estate, untouched since the 1950s. The Connecticut chateau, Le Beau Chateau, which she never visited, and several apartments in New York, all kept spotless by caretakers. Yet she lived in a single hospital room, hidden behind a door labeled private. The irony was chilling. While thousands of Americans struggled to afford health care, one of the wealthiest women in the nation voluntarily paid to stay confined within it. Outside, rumors began to spread. Reporters whispered of a missing heiress, of a reclusive woman whose wealth was being drained by those entrusted to care for her. Lawyers, accountants, and nurses surrounded her daily, some genuinely devoted, others seduced by proximity to unimaginable money. Over time, questions multiplied. Why had she not left? Who controlled her accounts? And how much of her fortune was being given away? By the 2000s, her name returned to headlines not for her art, but for intrigue. Investigations revealed that Huguette had gifted enormous sums to individuals around her. Millions in cash, rare paintings, even a Stradivarius violin to a nurse. One caregiver reportedly received over $30 million in gifts, including property and jewelry. Her attorney and accountant managed her affairs and received lavish compensation. The more the public learned, the more fascination turned to unease. Was she being manipulated, or was she in control all along? Letters, written in her own delicate handwriting, revealed a complex mind, lucid, generous, and fiercely private. She spoke of loneliness, but never of regret. "I want peace," she wrote in one note. Peace, and to be left alone. Yet the peace she sought came at the cost of human connection. Relatives who tried to reach her were blocked. Former employees who spoke out described her life as a kingdom of silence. She refused visitors, forbade photographs, and trusted only a few. It was during this long twilight of her life that her estate transformed from wealth into myth. The Clark holdings, once the beating heart of an industrial dynasty, had become haunted properties. Bellasguardo's gates rusted, its fountains dried. The Fifth Avenue apartment stood empty, their furniture draped in sheets. Inside, paintings worth millions waited in darkness, their colors unseen for half a century. The world outside raced into the digital age. Billionaires rose and fell. Fortunes were made in code and algorithms. Yet in her hospital room, Huguette remained frozen in time, a living relic of the Gilded Age, a woman out of sequence, preserved like an antique in her own story. Her detachment drew parallels to another generation of heiresses, Barbara Hutton, Doris Duke, women whose wealth became their prison. But Huguette's retreat was different. There was no addiction, no scandal, no moral collapse, only an almost sacred devotion to privacy. When journalists Bill Dedman and Paul Clark Newell Jr. uncovered her story in their book Empty Mansions, the world was stunned. How could a woman worth more than $300 million live for decades in a hospital room, without family, without celebration? The answer was simple and heartbreaking, because she wanted to. In her last years, she continued her daily rituals. She painted small landscapes. She watched cartoons from her bed. She wrote checks in elegant cursive for charities and museums. She celebrated birthdays alone, sometimes with a nurse, sometimes with no one at all. She never once stepped outside. The few who met her described a paradox: fragile yet commanding, generous yet cautious, lucid yet distant. She was not senile or delusional. She simply preferred a world she could control. The hospital room became her sanctuary, her monastery, her last fortress against betrayal. In her solitude, she carried not only her own fears, but the legacy of her father's world, a world that equated wealth with worth and silence with dignity. Perhaps she feared that stepping into the public would shatter the illusion of both. The longer she stayed hidden, the more the myth grew. Reporters called her the invisible heiress, the woman who wouldn't spend, the last daughter of the Gilded Age. But Huguette was not lost. She was waiting for what no one knew. When she died in May of 2011, at the age of 104, she left behind a silence so deep it resounded through history. Her estate was valued at over $300 million, and immediately the vultures descended. Distant relatives, lawyers, institutions, each claiming a share. Lawsuits followed. Accusations of elder abuse and exploitation filled courtrooms. Yet even in death, she remained an enigma. Her will, meticulously written, divided her fortune between charities, caretakers, and the creation of a foundation at Bellesguardo to preserve her home as a museum of art and beauty. The relatives contested it, arguing manipulation. But eventually, a settlement preserved much of her vision. And so, the woman who spent decades hiding from the world ended up gifting it something unexpected: access to her silence. In the stillness of her hospital room, surrounded by the dolls she once painted, Huguette Clark had done what her father never could. She turned wealth into restraint, opulence into introspection. Her life was not a failure of privilege, but a study in the unbearable loneliness of inheritance. For every gilded empire, there comes a reckoning the moment when abundance becomes burden and legacy becomes ghost. For the House of Clark, that reckoning came not through scandal or ruin, but through the quiet withdrawal of its last heiress, a woman who, in fleeing from the world, revealed its emptiness. When the end finally came, it arrived not with scandal or spectacle, but with the soft closing of a hospital door. On a quiet morning in May of 2011, Huguette Marcelle Clark passed away at the age of 104. No family gathered by her bedside. No reporters stood outside to record the moment. The nurses who had cared for her placed a single rose on her nightstand, turned off the lamps, and walked out of the room that had been her world for 2 decades. Outside, New York continued its restless rhythm. Few on Fifth Avenue realized that the woman who had once been heir to one of America's great fortunes had just left behind a mystery worth more than $300 million. Within hours, the news broke. Reclusive heiress Huguette Clark dies at 104. The headlines called her the woman who hid for 20 years. But death, for the Clarks, was never an ending. It was an invitation to war. Almost immediately, the battle for her estate began. Distant relatives, nieces, nephews, and descendants of her father's first marriage emerged from obscurity, claiming that Huguette had been manipulated in her final years. Lawyers argued that her nurse, accountant, and attorney had siphoned millions through gifts and advisory fees. Investigators discovered checks written for tens of thousands, properties purchased for others, and artwork donated under curious circumstances. The central question was not how much she had given, but why she had given so much. Court records later revealed that during her hospital years, Huguette had gifted over $40 million in cash and property to individuals around her. Her private nurse, Hadassah Perry, a gentle immigrant from the Philippines, had received houses, jewelry, and millions in bank transfers. Yet when asked whether she had exploited her employer, Perry wept and said, "She was my friend. She wanted to give. I never asked." Public opinion was divided. Some saw Huguette as a vulnerable woman taken advantage of by those she trusted. Others saw her as a lucid, eccentric recluse, exercising the one freedom her wealth allowed the freedom to give. Her letters, preserved in careful handwriting, revealed neither confusion nor compulsion. She wrote of gratitude, loneliness, and a wish to be remembered for kindness rather than extravagance. But the courts do not recognize sentiment. They demanded evidence, witnesses, and signatures. The will she left behind was dated and complex. It divided her fortune between charities, caregivers, and the creation of a Bellesguardo Foundation, a non-profit organization intended to transform her Santa Barbara estate into a museum for the arts. Her relatives, however, filed suit to contest it, arguing that undue influence had corrupted her intentions. The courtroom drama that followed was not unlike those that had haunted the Clarks a century earlier, the same struggle between legacy and greed, privacy and exposure. For months, newspapers once again printed the family name in bold letters, the Copper King's daughter, and the battle for the last gilded fortune. The proceedings were meticulous, almost theatrical. Lawyers debated the meaning of loyalty, the ethics of wealth, the psychology of solitude. Witnesses spoke of her gentle nature, her obsession with fairness, her refusal to harm anyone. The opposing counsel painted her as a prisoner of manipulation, her charity foundation as a fraud. In the end, the verdict was compromise, a truce between the living and the dead. The court approved a settlement in which her distant relatives received a portion of the estate, while the Bellasguardo Foundation retained the mansion and funding to preserve it as a cultural institution. The nurse, accused of financial misconduct, was required to return much of what she had received. Her lawyer and accountant faced public disgrace and professional ruin. Justice was served, but not peace. As the estate unraveled in court filings and inventories, the scale of Huguette's forgotten empire astonished even the most cynical observers. Inside storage units and safes were Renoirs, Monets, Degas, Japanese art, antique dolls, Stradivarius violins, and gilded frames that had not been touched in half a century. Some paintings still bore price tags from early 20th century galleries. In her apartments, drawers held sealed letters from presidents, artists, and curators who had long since died. At Bellasguardo, caretakers unlocked doors that had been shut since the 1950s. Dust drifted in sunlight through rooms perfectly preserved: the music salon, the marble staircase, the portrait gallery where Huguette's mother still smiled from her frame. The air smelled faintly of lavender and ocean salt. It was as if time itself had been waiting for permission to move again. But the world outside had changed. The age of fortunes built on copper and coal was gone. The empires of the Gilded Age had given way to empires of data, code, and speculation. Against this new backdrop, the story of Huguette Clark felt like an elegy, the last chapter of a civilization that once believed money could buy permanence. In truth, her decline had begun long before her death. It began when her father's palaces were torn down, when society shifted its gaze to newer gods. The Clark name, once printed on banks and railways, had faded from memory until it was rediscovered through tragedy. Her life, hidden for so long, became public property only when she could no longer defend it. The irony was cruel. The woman who fled attention became, in death, an icon of fascination. Documentaries, books, and think pieces dissected her motives, her habits, her supposed eccentricities. Some pitied her isolation, others envied her refusal to conform. The same society that had mocked her silence now demanded to interpret it. Her decline, then, was not financial, it was existential. The fortune endured, but its meaning dissolved. The Clark dynasty, once an empire of copper and ambition, ended not in scandal, but in stillness. Its last heir had chosen absence over legacy, and in doing so, revealed the emptiness that wealth could not fill. When the court battles finally ended, the dust settled over both Manhattan and Santa Barbara. The Bellasguardo Foundation opened its doors to the public, revealing the rooms exactly as Huguette had left them. The grand piano untouched, the curtains drawn, the art arranged with almost sacred precision. Visitors walked through her solitude as if trespassing upon a ghost. Every hallway whispered of a question without answer. Was this what peace looked like? Outside, the Pacific rolled against the cliffs. Inside, the sunlight pooled on marble floors where no one had walked in decades. The house stood like a monument not to luxury, but to the fragility of human desire, a reminder that even empires built on metal eventually corrode. Thus ended the dynasty of the Copper Kings. What began in the mines of Montana with pickaxes and molten fire concluded in a hospital room of quiet resignation. Between those two worlds stretched a century of ambition, excess, and isolation. The wealth that once electrified America now flickered as memory. In the final accounting, the fall of the Clark fortune was not measured in dollars, but in distance, the distance between power and peace, between inheritance and identity. Huguette's life, like the copper her father mined, conducted energy yet repelled touch. The house still stands, the art still gleams, but the woman who owned them all has vanished into her own silence, leaving behind only the faintest trace of warmth, a portrait painted by her own hand, still hanging in a corner of Bellasguardo, where the eyes seem to follow every visitor, as if searching for the world she once chose to leave behind. In the end, what remains of the Clark dynasty is not the copper, nor the palaces, nor the fortune that dazzled an age, but the silence that followed it. A silence so complete, so deliberate, that it speaks louder than the noise of industry which once announced their power to the world. When visitors walk today through Bellasguardo, the oceanfront estate in Santa Barbara that Huguette preserved like a memory sealed in glass, they do not see ruin, they see restraint. The rooms are immaculate. The furniture arranged as if awaiting guests who will never arrive. Her easel still stands in the sunlit studio. Her brushes rest beside unfinished watercolors. It is not a house abandoned, it is a shrine to the choice of solitude. Through the Bellasguardo Foundation, her wish was finally fulfilled. That her home become a place for art, reflection, and the quiet dignity that defined her life. Tourists, artists, and historians now walk through its corridors, whispering her name with the reverence once reserved for queens. Yet even in preservation, the house resists explanation. It is too beautiful for tragedy, too lonely for peace. Huguette Clark has become a symbol not of greed or eccentricity, but of the paradox at the heart of the American dream. Her father, William Andrews Clark, embodied the myth of self-made success, a man who clawed his way from a log cabin to the marble halls of Congress, who mined the earth and molded its riches into monuments of human will. His daughter inherited not only his fortune, but his burden, the unending search for acceptance in a world that measures worth by visibility. Where he conquered, she retreated. Where he demanded recognition, she vanished. And yet between them lies a strange symmetry. Both lived their lives in pursuit of legitimacy, one in the eyes of others, the other in the eyes of herself. In Huguette's refusal to appear, there was defiance, a rejection of the very spectacle that had defined her lineage. She watched the world turn wealth into performance and privilege into entertainment, and she simply stepped away. Her solitude was not madness, but protest. She lived without publicity, without extravagance, without the need to prove that she existed. Perhaps that is why her story lingers. Because in an era obsessed with exposure, she chose invisibility, and in doing so, exposed us all. Historians now call her the last daughter of the Gilded Age. But she was also its quiet conscience. Her life reminds us that wealth can illuminate cities yet darken hearts, that art can comfort the lonely but cannot replace companionship, and that behind every empire lies a human cost measured not in money but in moments unlived. In the museum that now bears her name, her own paintings hang beside those of the masters she admired: Renoir, Corot, and Degas. They are small, delicate works. A girl with flowers, a view of the sea, a self-portrait with downcast eyes. Each stroke feels like an apology to the world she fled. Outside, the sea continues its endless rhythm against the cliffs. The copper that once powered America has long tarnished, but the light of her story still flickers gentle, haunting, unresolved. Huguette Clark did not die poor, nor forgotten. She died exactly as she wished, in peace, without audience, without spectacle. Her fortune has scattered, her name endures, and her silence, the most fragile inheritance of all, has become her final legacy. Perhaps that is the truest reflection of the Copper King's empire, that all the wealth mined from the heart of the earth could not purchase a single moment of belonging. And so, from the roar of the Montana smelters to the whispering halls of Bellasguardo, the story of the Clarks closes as it began, with light glinting on metal and the question that time cannot answer. What is the value of fortune, if not the freedom to disappear? And so, the story of Huguette Clark and the Copper Kings comes to rest not in the roar of industry, but in the hush of solitude. A century ago, her father's copper lit the world. It powered the rails, the telegraphs, the very cities that pulsed with new life. Yet from that brilliance came a loneliness no fortune could escape. Huguette inherited more than her father's wealth. She inherited his silence. In the end, she turned away from the stage he built, choosing instead the quiet company of art, memory, and peace. Her empty mansions became monuments not to excess, but to introspection. To look at them now is to feel the echo of a question that has haunted every great dynasty. How much must we own before we realize that nothing truly belongs to us? Her story is not a tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting the fragile humanity behind all empires of wealth and power. The Clark dynasty, like so many others, reminds us that legacy is not measured in marble or money, but in the courage to seek meaning beyond them. As the sea wind drifts through Bellasquardo and the light fades across its empty halls, one truth remains. Even in silence, her voice endures a whisper carried through time, telling us that peace cannot be bought, only found. Thank you for joining us in this journey through the rise and fall of the Copper Kings, and through the quiet life of Huguette Clark, the heiress who vanished and yet left behind a legacy that still breathes. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe to Legacy of Rich Dynasties, where we uncover the untold stories of wealth, power, and the humanity that history tried to forget. Every dynasty has a secret, every fortune has a cost, and every story leaves a whisper behind.